20-second mark. T-minus 20
Cape Kennedy, Florida, the 11th of April, 1970. On the launch pad is Apollo 13, bound for the moon. The countdown unwound.
We have ignition sequence start. Engines on. 5, 4, 3, 2. All engines running.
We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. The Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
This is Mission Control Houston. We appear to have a good first stage at this point.
Apollo 13's commander, Jim Lovell, considered the mission the smoothest of the space program.
This is the crew of Apollo 13, wishing everybody there nice evening, and we're just about ready to close out our inspection of Aquarius and get back to a pleasant evening at Odyssey. Good night.
When Apollo 13 was nearly 56 hours into space and 200,000 miles from Earth, Mission Control told the crew, "We're bored to tears down here." Not for much longer.
Okay, stand by.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem. Had a main B bus undervolt.
Roger, main B undervolt. Okay, stand by at 13. We're looking at it.
And we had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there. And as I recall,
The relaxed routine was shattered. Apollo 13 was shuddering violently and failing to respond to the controls. It was the beginning of an epic of endurance and ingenuity, which was to test the nerve of Mission Control and its 3 astronauts to the very limit. Less than a year after Apollo 11 had placed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon, the world had grown blasé about space exploration. It seemed almost as effortless as the lazy somersaults described by astronaut Ed White, spacewalking above the Pacific Ocean in June 1965. But appearances can be deceptive. Space travel was an inherently hazardous undertaking. In March 1966, the 2-man Gemini 8 blasted off to rendezvous with the unmanned Agena satellite. 5 hours later, Gemini's commander, Neil Armstrong, began the docking maneuver. The 2 spacecraft came together as Armstrong nudged Gemini's nose into a docking collar mounted on Agena. But something was wrong. Agena and Gemini began to spin like a top. Armstrong and fellow astronaut Dave Scott were close to blackout as the assembly revolved at a rate of 60 times a minute. Armstrong broke Gemini free of Agena, but Gemini continued to spin even faster. One of the craft's thrusters had jammed at full power. It took Armstrong an hour to regain control. Gemini was brought back to safe splashdown in the Pacific. Disaster had been averted by a whisker. Four years later, Apollo 13's crew prepared for their mission. In command was the 42-year-old Jim Lovell, who had orbited the moon in Apollo 8 and had logged nearly 600 hours in space. Accompanying him were 2 rookies, 36-year-old Fred Hayes and 38-year-old Jack Swigert, a last-minute replacement for astronaut Ken Mattingly, who had been grounded after being exposed to German measles. Mattingly was at Mission Control to watch Apollo 13 blast off. In the prevailing atmosphere of calm confidence, all superstitions about the number 13 had been cast aside. If space travel could ever be called routine, then this was it.
Staging, Roger.
Flight fighter trajectory confirmed staging. Roger.
Flight boosted engine board out was way early.
First, Apollo had to burn out of Earth orbit toward the moon, then pull free of the third stage and dock with the lunar module Aquarius. At the controls of the command module, Odyssey, was Jack Swigert.
We're hard docked, Houston.
Roger, understand hard dock. Good deal.
They pulled Aquarius away from the Saturn third stage, the S4B.
Okay, I can see the S4B now at the hatch window.
Odyssey surged through space toward the moon. Monitoring every move from Houston was Flight Director Gene Kranz.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
When the crisis broke, Kranz galvanized his team into action. After the bang aboard Apollo 13, Mission Control's monitors told a tale of imminent disaster. The spacecraft was losing fuel, pressure, and temperature, and swinging to and fro like a schooner in a hurricane. Had Apollo 13 been hit by a meteorite?
Roger.
And we had a pretty large bang associated with the...
0 N2 pressure in fuel cell 1.
13 minutes after the explosion, Jim Lovell looked through the porthole.
What do you want to do? Open circuit fuel cell 1 and 3?
Just because of AC, and it looks to me, looking out the hatch, that we are venting something. We are venting something out into the...
What Lovell had seen was precious oxygen pouring out of Apollo's service module. The spacecraft was enveloped in a rapidly expanding bubble of debris and gas. Mission Control was now facing the unthinkable, losing astronauts in space for the first time.
That's the current flight. Let me look at the system flight as far as the damage is concerned.
Okay, let's start scanning.
Jim Lovell's thoughts were turning from not making the moon to not making it home at all. Starved of electrical power, the engine in Apollo 13 service module would not fire. Solutions were needed, and fast. While a small army of scientists and technicians at Houston considered their options, the plight of the astronauts became a news story which gripped the world. The press corps descended on Mission Control. The flight of Apollo 13 was about to turn into an extraordinary human drama. At Mission Control, decisions had to be made in hours that in other circumstances might have been pondered for weeks. How serious was the damage to Apollo 13? And how could it be contained? What supplies were left? And were they sufficient to bring the astronauts back home safely?
We're running D-logs down there. I'll tell you what, GNC, can you get somebody in the back room to try to figure out what the equivalent delta V is we're getting so that we can see if we can backtrack to see if we can figure out what's venting?
Backup teams of astronauts went to work on simulators which duplicated the stricken Apollo 13. The systems aboard the spacecraft would have to be reduced to the bare minimum needed to keep Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert alive. Now the first and crucial decision was made. Apollo 13 could not be turned around and its engine fired to power it back to Earth. It would have to be sent in a loop around the moon, and then use the moon's gravity to hurl the ship back towards Earth like a slingshot. But how was this to be done?
With the batteries, or that will cause us to lose the main or the fuel cell number 2?
The answer lay in Aquarius, the undamaged lunar excursion module, or LEM, now attached to the command module and crippled service module. Could its small engine be used to nudge Apollo 13 onto the course needed? Fred Hayes had played a key role in designing the LEM. Hard on the decision to use its engine came another. The crew could not survive the return journey in the command module. The LEM would have to become a lifeboat. But it had been built to hold only 2 men and to perform for only 40 hours. Now its systems would have to be extended to sustain 3 men for nearly 4 days. Guided by Mission Control, the astronauts put Odyssey into a kind of hibernation and transferred all the guidance controls to the LEM computer. Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert were now crammed into the lunar module Aquarius, attached to the dormant command module Odyssey. Apollo 13 had started as a mission of scientific exploration. It was now a fight for survival. It could have been worse. Had the explosion occurred when Lovell and Hayes were on the moon or returning to Odyssey, nothing could have saved them.
The first milestone, and I consider this after the accident, I guess, more or less the survival now. The first milestone was to get alignment on the LEM platform. Alignments are important, you know, because without knowing exactly which way the attitude of the spacecraft is in space, there's no way to tell how to burn or how to use the engines of that spacecraft to get the proper trajectory to come home.
By now, Houston had devised a maneuver which would give the astronauts their best chance of survival. They would go for a brief burn before Apollo 13 reached the moon, placing it in the so-called free return trajectory. This would be followed by a second burn to drop them into the slot for re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. 5.5 hours after the blast which had crippled Apollo 13, the astronauts prepared to fire Aquarius descent engine in a 31-second burst.
He needs to put his throttle to min also, Mike. Throttle to min.
Jim Lovell takes up the story.
This maneuver again was completed on time, and because it was a manual burn, we had a three-man operation. Jack would take care of the time. He'd tell us when to light off the engine, when to stop it. Fred handled the pitch maneuver, I handled the roll maneuver, and I pushed the buttons to start and stop the engines.
Aquarius, and you go for the burn. %. Okay, Aquarius, you're looking good. Auto shutdown.
The first problem had been solved. Apollo 13 was back on course to Earth. But many more problems remained. In Houston, efforts were redoubled to ensure that the astronauts were kept alive before they ran out of everything. There was enough to eat and drink. Concern centered on other so-called consumables: electricity to power the LEM, water to cool its systems, and oxygen to keep the three astronauts alive.
It appears at the present time that everything is under control and that we have a safe situation at the moment.
Hey, I want to say you guys are doing real good work. So are you guys, Jack.
Another key decision had to be made before Apollo 13 disappeared behind the moon: where to bring it down. Their present course would take the astronauts to a splashdown in the Indian Ocean, where recovery would be difficult. A burn to get them home quicker would take them to the Pacific Ocean, within easy reach of the U.S. Navy's recovery forces. The decision was made to bring Apollo 13 down in the Pacific. Meanwhile, conditions on board the LEM were deteriorating. The astronauts' most dangerous enemy was now their own exhaled breath. 36 hours after they had retreated to the LEM, a cabin light flashed a warning that carbon dioxide was reaching dangerous levels. Working under instructions from Houston, the men on Apollo used pressure suit hoses, batteries, tape and plastic and cardboard from a flight manual to hook the command module's air purifiers to the LEM. Later, Jim Lovell compared the process to building a model aeroplane. It looked ramshackle, but it worked. At Houston and in the LEM, everyone breathed more easily.
Reading about 15 millimeters. And we constructed two of these things and put them online, and I think within an hour the partial pressure of CO2 was down to 2/10.
So you see that survival now became one of initiative and ingenuity, and it was one which the ground continually helped us along. We had all kinds of people on the ground trying to think of ways of extending our lifetime.
Apollo 13 looped around the moon, so near and yet so far. But the astronauts were not out of the woods yet. Another critical burn was approaching when they resumed communications with Houston.
Okay, let's get the cameras put away. Get off in the burn. itself.
At Mission Control, the press corps was in full cry, following the astronauts every step of the way. The moment of truth arrived.
Jim, you go for the burn. Go for the burn. Roger, understand. Go for the burn.
Guidance okay? We're good, flight. Control okay? We're okay, flight. Tell me it. We're go, flight. Nico okay?
We're good, flight.
Ground confirms ignition.
We're burning 40%.
West Houston, you're looking good.
Roger. Shut down.
Roger, shut down.
I say that was a good burn. Roger, now we want to power down as soon as possible.
Immediately after the burn, Lovell began to power down the LEM. To conserve electrical power and cooling water, the mission commander shut down all but Aquarius' vital life-sustaining systems. The parts of the craft exposed to solar radiation now became blazingly hot, while on the unexposed dark sides, the temperature plummeted. Unable to don their spacesuits in the LEM, the astronauts were cold, damp, and prey to depression. Teflon overalls turned slimy and freezing to the touch. Jim Lovell likened their plight to frogs in a frozen pond.
We're going to have to start thinking about getting people back to sleep again because I didn't get any sleep last night at all.
The command module just slowly kept going down in temperature until I think just prior to reentry, it was down to about 38 degrees. And along with that, there was a sort of a chilling coldness. The walls were perspiring, the windows were completely wet, and it wasn't too healthy. I recall that we went in there to get some hot dogs one day, and it was like reaching into the freezer for the food.
The astronauts were entering the home stretch, but another hurdle lay ahead. The wrecked service module was still venting small amounts of gas, enough to push Apollo 13 out of its re-entry corridor. Experts at Houston decided that another engine burn was needed to achieve exact alignment into the narrow re-entry corridor through the Earth's atmosphere.
We're at burn attitude, flight.
College. Ignition. Thrust looks good. Shut down. Hang in there, it won't be long.
The astronauts were unaware that they had become the center of attention for almost the entire planet. Millions grabbed every scrap of news as Apollo 13 drew closer to Earth. Millions more prayed.
Lord, your astronauts will come back safe. If I may be serious for one moment and ask the entire audience for a moment of prayer for the crewmen of the Apollo 13. We'll hold silence for a moment, please.
Jim Lovell put it succinctly.
In a situation like that, there's only one thing you can do. You just keep going, and you just keep thinking up where you can get more consumables. And so that's exactly what we did.
On Friday, the 17th of April, the astronauts prepared for re-entry. 5 hours before the predicted splashdown, Lovell fired Aquarius steering jets to improve target landing accuracy. An hour later, Swigert threw the switches that separated Aquarius from the service module.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing.
Is that right?
The whole panel is blown out, almost from the base to the engine.
Really a mess. Man, that's unbelievable.
Next, the astronauts clambered back into Odyssey to jettison Aquarius before re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. They fired charges to separate Aquarius, and their lifeboat hopped away like a champagne cork.
Farewell, Aquarius. We thank you.
An hour later, Odyssey hurtled into the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. Inside the module, it started to rain. as gravity forces detached water droplets from the walls. For 3 minutes during re-entry, the command module fell silent, as an ionized sheath cut off all communications with Mission Control. One last question remained. Would Odyssey's parachutes work? Houston held its breath. The tension was almost unbearable.
We have about a minute and a half to go during this period of blackout.
A worldwide audience tensely awaited splashdown. Contact was regained.
Odyssey Houston standing by, over.
Okay, go.
Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Apollo 13 had broken through cloud over the Pacific at 2,000 feet, swinging lazily between its 3 chutes.
Report from the Iwo Jima that Apollo 13 is descending at a point 4 miles due south of the ship.
Photo 1's on station. Photo 1 observes splash down at this time. I'll take up
Remarkably, it had been the most accurate splashdown of any Apollo mission to date. The carrier Iwo Jima had been barely 3 miles away. Her helicopters hovered to lift the astronauts from Odyssey.
That's okay.
Home at last.
Climbing out of the command module and is in the egress raft.
As the 3 astronauts arrived on the carrier's deck, the ship's band burst into a rousing version of the Age of Aquarius. Now it was time to celebrate at Houston and break out the traditional cigars. President Nixon was quickly on the phone to Jim Lovell.
I recall, Captain, that when I spoke to you on the phone, you said that you regretted that you were unable to complete your mission. I hereby declare that this was a successful mission.
Back at home, the President put on a heroic gloss on the mission of Apollo 13. The astronauts truly were heroes, but the explosion on board the spacecraft had threatened not only their lives, but the entire manned space program. The inquest began after splashdown. Disaster flowed from the routine order for Jack Swigert to switch on the fans which stirred Apollo 13's tanks of supercool hydrogen and oxygen, supplying the spacecraft with breathing air, drinking water, and electricity. Two electric wires touched, sparked, and set fire to the tank's insulation. Then came the bang, which ripped out the side of the service module. The lingering death it had threatened was thwarted by the courage of Apollo 13's crew and the coolness of the men at Mission Control. Twinwood Farm, near Bedford in England. A wartime fighter base at the heart of one of the most mysterious episodes in the Second World War. Just after 7 in the evening on the 24th of December 1944, the BBC announced Major Alton Glenn Miller, director of the famous United States Army Air Force Band, is reported missing while on a flight from England to Paris. The plane in which he was a passenger left England on December the 15th, and no trace of it has been found since takeoff. Glenn Miller, most popular band leader of the era, had vanished into thin air. The official version of the events which led to his disappearance has become one of the great myths of the war. How did Glenn Miller meet his end? Glenn Miller had shot to fame in the late 1930s. The smooth saxophone sound of his orchestra was instantly recognizable the world over. After years of struggle, Miller was a celebrity, and his orchestra the most sought after in America. Success took Miller to Hollywood. Half of Europe had been occupied by Adolf Hitler, but the citizens of Beverly Hills were more occupied with the good life in California. The war seemed a long way off. Hollywood was in the business of dreams, not bombs. The Glenn Miller Orchestra topped the bill in the most exclusive clubs in town. In a short time, Glenn Miller had become a very rich man. He was also becoming a fixture in the movie musicals, which were one of the screen staples of the day. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 put a stop to all that. America was now at war, and within 3 months the first GIs were strolling the streets of London, examining historical landmarks. And some of London's cultural attractions. The Windmill Review, with its mixture of low comics and nude tableau, boasted "We never close." It had stayed open throughout the Blitz and was one of London's great show business institutions, a magnet for master sergeants. A number of Hollywood institutions were joining up. Film stars Tyrone Power and Clark Gable. Dance bands like Gene Krupa's were pitching into the war effort, giving concerts at training camps. In November 1942, Glenn Miller volunteered and was inducted into the Army with the rank of captain. His orchestra was broken up, and for a while their leader found himself exiled to the musical Siberia of military band music. Eventually, he was asked to form the American Air Force Band, which contained many of his musicians. The band's manager, with the rank of lieutenant, was a booking agent named Don Haynes. Miller was desperate to entertain troops overseas, and after some string pulling in Washington, he and the band arrived in England in the summer of 1944. It was a long way from California, or Miller's comfortable family home in Tenafly, New Jersey. The band, exuding brash American confidence, had arrived in a welcoming but pinched and war-weary Britain. In Trafalgar Square, the base of Nelson's column was plastered with propaganda posters. After D-Day, the end of the war was in sight, but the rigors and restrictions of rationing seemed to stretch into the future. Overhead droned Hitler's V-1 flying bombs, fraying the nerves of civilians on their flight path. On the other side of the Channel, Allied troops had finally broken out of the Normandy bridgehead and were racing across northern France. their route was lined with cheering French villagers. The way to Paris lay open. But each and every soldier knew that much hard fighting lay ahead before the defeat of Nazi Germany. Miller, now a major, was kept busy in England. A few feathers were ruffled by the fact that most of his audiences were American. Miller's British fans felt left out. The stuffy BBC seemed reluctant to give Miller's swing music much of an airing. And Miller himself complained of exhaustion and alarming weight loss. Was he just tired or seriously ill? Nevertheless, he continued to keep up a punishing schedule. In England, Miller's boss was the movie star David Niven. Before he launched his career in Hollywood, Niven had been a regular army officer. After a lively war, later recounted in his autobiography The Moon's a Balloon, Niven was now a lieutenant colonel and the associate director of troop broadcasting in special services. One of Niven's responsibilities was to organize a series of concerts which the Air Force Band was to play in Paris at the end of December 1944. Glenn Miller had a suite in the Mount Royal Hotel in London, but Niven had also found him a base 50 miles north of the capital, in Bedford, where most of the BBC had been evacuated in 1939. The pleasant, rolling countryside around Bedford was a welcome relief from the dangers of London's V1 bomb alley. Nearby was the picturesque village of Milton Ernest, whose hall housed the headquarters of the US 8th Air Force's Service Command. Here Miller and Don Haynes got to know a staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Norman F. Basel, who was responsible for the supply and servicing of 8th Air Force airfields in liberated Europe. This part of England was crammed with 8th Air Force and RAF bases. From here, B-17 bombers took off to pound the heart of the Reich. A stone's throw from Milton Ernest was the airfield at Twinwood Farm, a sprawling night fighter training station where Beaufighter and Mosquito aircrew learned the deadly secrets of their trade. Wartime ghosts still haunt Twinwood Farm, but the runway down which the night fighters once thundered has been replaced by a beet field. On the edge of the woods which fringe the station, mouldering huts and rusty hangars recall the past. According to the manager of Miller's band, Don Haynes, it was to Twinwood that he drove with his boss and Colonel Basel on the morning of the 15th of December 1944. Basel had offered Miller a lift to Paris when all other flights in the UK had been grounded. In bad weather conditions, a 200-foot cloud base and heavy rain, the three men waited outside the control tower for the arrival of Basel's aircraft from nearby Abbots Ripton. An American ferry pilot, John Morgan, who regularly took Basel to Europe, would be flying it. The plane appeared through the cloud. Miller and Basel clambered aboard the single-engined Norseman, and Morgan took off at approximately 1:45 p.m. Neither he nor his passengers, Miller and Basel, were ever seen again. Or so Don Haynes' story goes. The small, dapper Morgan was competent enough in clear conditions, but was a poor instrument pilot. However, Twinwood's daily wartime history, officially known as Form 540, records that on Friday, the 15th of December, the airfield was closed. It states, "No flying today." Was Glenn Miller aboard a plane which never took off from Twinwood, or did he disappear after an accident or incident so embarrassing that a cover story for his last flight was cooked up to hide the truth? Morgan never filed a flight plan, but in the official version of subsequent events, the Norseman flew from either Abbots Ripton or Twinwood and then over Bovingdon Airfield to cross the channel at Beachy Head, skirting a bomb jettison area. It then headed towards the coast of France and Morgan's planned destination. This route has prompted the theory that the Norseman, flying low and slow over the channel, was caught in a rain of bombs jettisoned by a returning Allied bomber formation. Aircrew have stepped forward to claim this dubious honor. But careful research indicates that Morgan took an entirely different course to France. During this period, a Norseman was lost over the channel to jettisoned bombs. But this was on the 16th of December, and the records confirm that it was an entirely different plane, on its way to delivery in Chartres. A clue to the Glenn Miller mystery may lie in the slightly sinister figure of Norman Basel. The 44-year-old colonel was a brash and brutal man. One of his ferry pilots observed that he was about as subtle as a loaded .45 revolver. Basel's job took him all over Europe, opening up and supplying airfields and enabling him to cut through much of the red tape which surrounded flying to the continent. He was a notably reckless operator, frequently ordering Morgan and other pilots to fly in hazardous conditions for which the Norsemen's primitive instruments were not equipped. On the 17th of September 1944, Basel and his pilot had run into the Air Armada bound for the drop at Arnhem. He ordered his pilot to follow the stream into the battle zone and only escaped being shot down by a whisker. Basel's favorite expression was, "Do you want to live forever?" It seemed as if the blustering colonel did not. Paris was a frequent port of call for Colonel Basel. The French capital had been liberated in August 1944, amid scenes of wild rejoicing and the summary dispatch of those suspected of collaborating with the Germans. Within days of the Americans' arrival, Paris's famous nightlife was back in full swing. Basel always had lots of money to spend in Paris, and plenty of financial interests in nightclubs, restaurants and shops selling luxury items. Paris, with its wealthy population, who had sat out the war, was the perfect arena for black marketeering on a large scale. It has been suggested that Basel was up to his neck in the black market, and was also playing a shadowy role in illegal currency dealing. There would be no shortage of takers. When Basel went to France, he invariably took several large crates with him, ostensibly containing cigarettes. But France was awash with camels and lucky strikes. No amount of them could finance the activities that Basel was rumored to be masterminding. One of the 8th Air Force Special Command's storage depots was near Bedford, at the airfield at Honington. It held huge quantities of aircraft first aid kits. 4-engine bombers like the B-17 carried 8, each of which contained 10 ampoules of morphine. Although there is no evidence to prove it, morphine, a more potent and lucrative drug than nicotine, might have been Basel's business. In moving it, he had the singular advantage of being able to organize direct clearance from Honington to Europe without having to undergo an automatic customs check at RAF Bovingdon. It has been suggested that Glenn Miller may have been mixed up in some way with Basel's black market activities. One thing is now almost certain. Miller did not fly with Basel and Morgan on the 15th of December. Don Haynes had booked Miller on a Dakota shuttle flight from Bovingdon to Paris on or about the 15th of December. On the 15th, flights from Bovingdon continued until 3 p.m., when bad weather closed them down. Could Glenn Miller have been arrested at Bovingdon when a routine search revealed that, in all innocence, he was carrying some of Basel's contraband? Or did he catch a flight to Paris on the 14th? After the war, the BBC sound engineer attached to Miller's band, Teddy Gower, claimed to have travelled to Paris in the seat behind him on that day. Strong evidence that Miller did reach France is provided by Joan Heath, who was the personal driver of Air Marshal Tedder, the British deputy to the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, and based at Ike's headquarters at Versailles. On the 16th of December, Eisenhower threw a big party to celebrate his promotion to the rank of General of the Army. According to Joan Heath, Glenn Miller was at the party. At about 2 a.m., Eisenhower instructed her to drive Miller to a nearby airfield. Here, Miller boarded a Bobcat aircraft clutching several parcels which he told her were Christmas presents for his family stateside. The Bobcat lacked the range to fly the Atlantic. If Joan Miller's story is true, he must have been going to another base to board a bigger plane. Don Haynes arrived in Paris on the 18th of December to find Miller missing. No official search was made for the aircraft. Given Miller's celebrity, this seems unusual, but it is explicable if those in Supreme Allied Command, including General Eisenhower, knew that Miller had not gone down in John Morgan's Norseman on the 15th of December. Intriguingly, several days after the party on the 16th, Joan Heath asked Eisenhower if he had heard from Glenn Miller, to which Ike replied, "Maybe I'll never hear." 10 days elapsed between Miller's probable flight from Bovington and the announcement of his disappearance. Time enough, if the Allied top brass knew what had really happened, to concoct a story of Miller's flight on the Norseman. This goes some way to explaining Eisenhower's wistful remark to Joan Heath about never seeing Glenn Miller again. The details of the Norseman flight, as retailed by the faithful Don Haynes, and later enshrined in his so-called diaries, were in all probability derived from a flight to Paris which Haynes had made with Basel on the 8th of November. This is Morgan's Norseman, photographed on that day with an RAF fitter, Alex Sleep. The weather details in Haynes' account fit those for the 8th of November, but do not match the Met reports for the 15th of December. It seems likely that on the 15th of December, Morgan flew alone, taking a more easterly route than that officially suggested. He probably flew over London and crossed the Channel coast at Dymchurch, where the Royal Observer Corps spotted a Norseman at about 2:25 p.m. Nevertheless, an official missing aircrew report, which was released in 1948, names Miller and Basel as Morgan's passengers. Careful examination suggests that this document is a forgery, typed on 2 different typewriters on 2 separate occasions. But was Basel aboard the Norseman? Research by Wilbur and David Wright has revealed that the U.S. Army was paying Basel's pension well into the 1950s. Which leaves John Morgan feeding the fishes somewhere in the Channel. His Norseman, with its identifying engine number, has never been found. A further twist to the tale is given by the curious silence of David Niven. Niven was both Miller's boss and a friend. According to some reports, he was seen with Miller drinking in a Paris bar on the afternoon of the 14th of December. In his best-selling autobiography, The Moon's a Balloon, Niven devoted much space to his wartime career, but he makes no mention of his association with Glenn Miller or his legendary disappearance. To the end of his days, Niven declined to be drawn on the affair. In The Moon's a Balloon, Niven recounts that on the 16th of December 1944, the Germans launched a massive offensive in the Ardennes. Niven hurried up to the front line to rescue his friend Marlene Dietrich, who was entertaining the American troops there. One of Niven's former colleagues remembered receiving a telephone call from the British Star, who told him, "We're going to get Marlene." Was Niven accompanied by Glenn Miller? In her own autobiography, Dietrich tells of seeing an overturned jeep as she was driven to safety. Someone in it had been badly injured. Was this a disguised reference to an accident which befell Glenn Miller? Was this the secret which David Niven carried to his grave? Significantly, perhaps, a skin condition prevented Miller from wearing a dog tag, and in the confusion, he may not have been recognized. After the war, stories circulated that Miller had been seen in an army hospital in Columbus, Ohio, suffering from severe head injuries. In April 1987, an inquiry by Wilbur Wright received this reply from the state of New Jersey. The letter was later dismissed as a typing error. But David Niven did not attend Eisenhower's party on the 16th, and Miller could not have been in two places at once. The last known sighting of Glenn Miller was not made by Don Haynes in England, but probably by Joan Heath in France, after the party thrown by General Eisenhower. Was Miller being flown back to the United States to face a court-martial connected with Basel's activities? If so, why was he apparently hobnobbing with Ike only a few hours before his departure? No record of any court-martial has been uncovered in the United States, although there would have been no need for one if Miller had had a nervous breakdown and was judged unfit to plead. Or did an ailing Miller die of cancer shortly after his return? Miller's brother Herb believed that Glenn died in England in November 1944, and in the weeks before his disappearance was impersonated by a lookalike. When the time came to celebrate VE Day in May 1945, Glenn Miller was already becoming a footnote to the history of the Second World War. The control tower at Bovingdon is now no more, but the Glenn Miller mystery persists. Also gone is one of 8 documents in a missing personnel file on Glenn Miller sent to Washington on the 28th of December 1944. This is not a missing aircrew report, but a report reserved for those not involved in the disappearance of an aircraft. One document should contain the details of Miller's last days, but like Major Alton Glenn Miller, this too has vanished without trace. In the Glenn Miller myth, the band leader took off from Twinwood with Basel and Morgan on the 15th of December 1944 and went down in the Channel. But a growing pile of evidence, particularly that collected by Wilbur and David Wright for their book Millergate, has cast doubt on the official version. Crucially, there was no flying at Twinwood on the 15th of December. Miller was seen by Teddy Gower on a Dakota on the 14th and later in Paris by Joan Heath. Thereafter, he disappears from view. No search was ever made for the Norseman. It would have been unnecessary if the top brass, including the Supreme Allied Commander, already knew what had happened to Glenn Miller. Did Glenn Miller suffer a near-fatal accident after saying goodbye to Joan Heath? Was he then flown back to America to die in a hospital in Ohio? The letter to Wilbur Wright from the state of New Jersey suggests that this is a distinct possibility. Attempts to uncover the truth about Glenn Miller are still being blocked by the US government, and the US authorities have been equally uncooperative about revealing the secrets of Colonel Basel's posthumous pension payments. Some researchers believe that Basel was paid off, and after the war turned up in Rhodesia, now the independent state of Zimbabwe. Was Glenn Miller's disappearance the result of a tragic accident, or was he engaged on work for the US government which went wrong, and whose failure was too embarrassing to reveal even today? The hunt for the truth continues.